Well, it's come to the time where it's the final breakdown of the series Band of Brothers. With an episode that is tonally different to every other one that made up the series, this finale was quite literally the perfect way that this show could have ended. By concluding with the interviews instead of starting with them, and some of the most powerful moments occurring in the final minutes, this episode is most definitely one of the most emotional ones to bear witness to. Right up until the final line of dialogue that was spoken, it wasn't emotional because it was sad, but emotional because it was just so inspiring to watch. But we'll get into all of that. So with that, let's break down episode 10 and delve into the finale of Band of Brothers. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The final episode of Band of Brothers was titled Points, and we found out exactly why it was called that later on in the episode. This was because towards the end of the episode, it was the end of the war in Europe, and in order for some of the men to be discharged, they had to have earned enough points to be able to have gone home. This was 85 points in total. If they didn't have enough points, then they were going to be reassigned to the Pacific Theatre and head out to Japan to fight the war that was continuing out there. Even if you were within a few points, that didn't mean anything. It meant you still had to go. So that's where the title of this episode came from. When the episode opened up, it was July 1945 and it was set in Zell am See, Austria. There was a voiceover from Major Winters where he was almost reflecting on the difference in environment to what he was now in compared to what it had been throughout the past year. He said how 3 years prior to that was when himself and Nixon decided to sign up to the Airborne Division, but from what we'd seen throughout the show, it was now totally different. We saw these men in the worst conditions unimaginable, in freezing temperatures in Bastogne without the correct amount of equipment, clothing or supplies, and without the ability to move freely without the chance of being killed. However now, Winters was taking leisurely swims in the lake in the morning before going and getting a hot shower and some breakfast. After the voiceover, we saw that Nixon went over to Winters, and I don't know if this was deliberate, but on the lake there were 2 ducks just sitting there looking peaceful and swimming around. And even if this wasn't deliberate, I feel like it was almost symbolic of Winters and Nixon essentially being at peace and being at a stage of the war where they were finally able to think about being able to go back home, and not the fear of not making it back. Winters had bargained a deal and got photos which dated all the way back to when they were at Toccoa, and we saw just how different the both of them were. They both didn't know what they were getting themselves into back then, but now, on the other side, they were completely different men. This also showed just how close of a bond the both of them had and that they were quite literally like brothers. Nixon offered Winters a job at this moment too, working in New Jersey when they were both planning on returning home after the war. There was a line in the voiceover that Winters said where he mentioned that there were job offers being spoken about and the war wasn't even technically over. So it showed that what was once considered unlucky, talking about making it back home, was now something which was pretty much seen as an inevitability. Berchtesgaden was the place which the 101st Airborne Division were heading towards, and they wanted to capture the town first. This was an important town to capture because it was one where many of the heads of the Third Reich had their houses. It was also protected because roads had been destroyed and it was blocked off in a way which made it difficult for it to be entered. We saw that there was essentially a race to the Eagle's Nest, and we saw in the show that it was the 101st Airborne Division that were the first to capture the town and make it to the top of the mountain to the Eagle's Nest. However, that is something that apparently isn't actually true. It's actually said that infantrymen from the 3rd Infantry Division made it to the top first. The 101st Airborne Division and the French 2nd Armoured Division were supposed to capture it, but under the command of General John O'Daniel, the 3rd Infantry Division took it. So there is a slight historical difference there. However, the 101st Airborne Division maintains that they were the first there. Once the men had made it into Berchtesgaden, we saw that they were looting and taking things that would either be worth money or they'd be able to keep from their time in the war. This ranged from cutlery and other pieces of silverware. After they'd made it to the Eagle's Nest, many of the men were drinking and celebrating, and enjoying the fact that they'd made it there first. But there was a poignant moment where it felt like time stood still for a second. This was when Winters walked out there and said that the German army had officially surrendered. The blank faces that were present on all of them, but mainly on Harry's, was something which really encapsulated that feeling of it was over. They'd gone through so much, lost so many people that they were close to, felt lucky to be alive, and now it was all just gonna be done. Words probably couldn't have described how that felt, hence why the stunned silence was far more powerful. Harry offered Winters a drink in that moment and said that they wanted him to have a bit so they could finally say that they saw him have some. Winters didn't drink throughout the show, and that was something that was always present. When looking at the real-life Richard Winters, when he was asked about that, he apparently said that he didn't like to talk about it that much, but his grandfather was a drinker, and he saw what it did to his family, so that's probably where his mindset around drinking and choosing not to came from. With the group being in Berchtesgaden and it being a place where there was no conflict, things to loot, plenty of drink to have, and time to relax, many of them didn't want to leave. However, when they got to Austria, things got even better for them. At this point, we saw that many of the troops were being told that if they had enough points, then they'd have the option to go home. As I said at the start, they needed 85 points in order to be discharged. Before that though, we saw the men watching the fighting that was going on in Okinawa in the Pacific Theatre, and the fact that whilst they were relaxing in Austria because the war that they'd been fighting in was over, there were many US soldiers that were dying on the other side of the world. I can't even begin to fathom what it must have been like, fighting in Europe, feeling that sense of victory and like there was a chance that you'd be going home, to then being told that you're going to be flying over to Japan to then fight in a completely different terrain, in a completely different style of warfare. When this was announced to the men, we saw that many of their faces dropped and the sense of dread re-entered their mind, because at that moment they felt like their time was done. With the words, "We'll begin training to go to war," being spoken, it almost marked the beginning again. They went through war and came out the other side, yet there was still the prospect of them needing to go through it all again. With regards to the points that the men needed to go home, we saw that Shifty Powers was one of the men that got a focus because he didn't have enough. He needed 15 points, and within real life, he was actually one of the very few people who was never wounded in combat. Even though he was on the line with Easy Company every time they fought, he never found himself wounded. However, like was depicted in the show, he won the lottery to be able to go home early. But during his journey back, he was involved in an accident which meant that he was badly injured. Due to this, he spent several months recovering in hospitals overseas, and it actually meant that many of his other comrades ended up getting home before he did. Shifty Powers eventually died in 2009 in Clinchco, Virginia, the same place in which he was born 86 years earlier. There was a powerful moment in Shifty's farewell to Major Winters, where he said how he wasn't sure how he was going to explain all of this. This showed an insight into the mindset and the reality that people were facing upon the prospect of going home. The people back home didn't truly know what these men went through and what they had to do, and that was something that was starting to present itself to Shifty, and I imagine many of the other men that were there too. Whilst the men were in Austria, there was a scene where they were out hunting deer. However, when it came to them shooting the deer, they couldn't bring themselves to do it. This almost felt like it was symbolic of the fact that there'd been so much bloodshed and death that was present throughout the entirety of their time there that they couldn't bring themselves to kill another thing, especially without a need or motive to. As the episode went on, we saw that Richard Winters wanted to transfer to the 13th Airborne Division because they were heading out to the Pacific a lot sooner than what the 101st would be. Something that was a big decision because it would mean that he'd no longer be alongside the men that he'd been with since the Toccoa days. However, he said a line which I thought was quite a poignant one. He said, "They don't need me anymore." This was so different to how he was more towards the start of the show, whereas now he saw and felt that the company ran fine without him, and they were almost like this machine that were able to run because of the brotherhood and togetherness that they'd formed throughout their experiences. We saw that Winters was told by the general that he didn't need to transfer to the 13th Airborne and that he'd be better suited staying with the 101st because they did actually need him. He was best suited to those men because despite the fact that he felt as though they didn't need him, they deserved to have him there. As we embarked onto the final third of the episode, this was where we saw the tone change even more. There were a lot of men that were there, but there was no enemy for them to fight, so they lacked any real purpose, and this was something which was difficult for them to be able to manage. Vengeance was something that we saw taking place with Liebgott as he wanted to take out the commander of a concentration camp that they liberated. He said it wasn't personal, but by the way that he acted and also by the way he said, "What you did to my people," it showed that he wanted to seek some kind of personal justice for all of the Jewish people that were murdered in the camps. Liebgott fired a shot, but it didn't kill the commander. However, as he was running away, another shot was fired and he was then killed. It's hard to know if this is something that actually happened, as we didn't know the name of the commander and it isn't properly documented anywhere. However, the fact that it was questioned if it was the right person by Webster in conversation, maybe it leans into the fact that justice being taken into one's own hands doesn't necessarily come with the evidence or certainty that it would if it went through the proper systems. We don't know if it was the right person, but to Liebgott, it was. After this, we saw that Janovec was working alongside a German soldier, and relations were different for different people. For example, Webster had some resistance and didn't feel that comfortable. We saw a couple of episodes back that he had some pent-up anger and emotions when seeing the 300,000 that initially surrendered, so his annoyance and lack of friendliness when compared to Janovec's was understandable. The German soldier said that it was the end of his second war, and one can only presume that because of his age it meant that he fought in the Great War and the Second World War. For some reason, that line really carried weight to it. We didn't see or hear of anybody else doing that in the show, but in one lifetime having to fight in two large-scale wars where there was so much death and devastation, it's unimaginable. In this moment, when Janovec was relieved of his duty, we saw that he was involved in an accident when a drum fell off a truck and caused the vehicle that he was in to topple over, something which ultimately killed him, showing that even though the war was over, death was something that still had its way of finding people. This is something that did happen in reality, and he was only 20 years old when he died. Another moment where death and danger was present in what should have been a safe time was when Sergeant Grant was shot by Mac after stumbling across him drunk after shooting a German. This is something that was actually true in reality. Within real life, Sergeant Grant was shot when he tried to disarm a replacement from I Company called Floyd Craver after he'd shot two Germans, a British major and the major's driver. Like was depicted in the show, Spears drove Grant to a German brain surgeon after being told by the medic that Grant wouldn't survive. After he did survive though, the German brain surgeon said that he was one of the toughest men that he'd ever seen, as he didn't think that he'd survive the surgery. Grant went on to live a full life and died in 1982. Because of the injury, he did have some paralysis down one side of his body, and he also had some speech problems too. With regards to the replacement, he was handed over to the MPs like Spears ordered the men to do in the show, and was tried at court-martial for the murders of the people that he killed. It was said that it was difficult to determine whether or not he was insane when he carried out the killings, but he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, shortly after, he was released following his sentencing. When it came to post-war life and his death, in 1987, Floyd Craver was hit by a truck and died whilst he was riding a moped. In the closing moments of the episode, we saw the tone move away from death, and it focused more on what was going to be happening throughout this time where they were essentially waiting. Winters wanted the men to have a purpose again, and he assigned men to do different things. For example, Malarkey was going off to Paris to be a technical advisor, and he said that he didn't think he'd be seeing him around there anymore. There was a moment just before the German general gave a speech to his men where Sobel reappeared for the third time in the show and tried to walk past Winters without acknowledging him. But Winters called him over and told him that you salute the rank and not the man, showing that Winters was now in a higher rank than him, and even though Sobel didn't want to salute him, it was part of the procedure and protocol, something that Sobel always swore to act by. This was kind of a full circle moment for Winters, and realistically it was a way of humiliating Sobel in front of the men. For me, Nixon's face at this moment was something which really added to the scene, just shaking his head at this feud that was going on and seeing the pathetic yet humorous side to it. This was something that was said to have actually happened. When it came to the German general addressing his men before they surrendered to Lipton, he gave a speech which was something which suited not only the Germans, but also the US troops that were listening as well. It showed that it was applicable to both sides of the war. He said, "It's been a long war. It's been a tough war. You fought bravely, proudly for your country. You're a special group who have found in one another a bond that exists only in combat, among brothers of shared foxholes, held each other in dire moments, who've seen death and suffered together. I'm proud to have served with every one of you. You deserve long and happy lives of peace." As he gave this speech, it cut between many of the men from Easy, showing that it was something that was applicable to them as well. It almost just showed that many of the men that were there were just carrying out their duty and fulfilling what they needed to do, no matter what side of the war they were on. They both carried the same trauma, suffered the same experiences, and shared the same sense of brotherhood. The final thing that we saw in this episode was on D-Day plus 434, where the men were finally told that they were able to go home. This was one of the most emotional moments in the entirety of the show. We had Winters narrating over the top as we heard about what happened to many of the men when they returned home from the war. The environment of them playing baseball with one another, having fun for the first time in the entirety of the show without the threat of something happening to them. It was just a polar contrast to everything that we'd seen throughout the 10 episodes. We'd never seen them with true smiles on their faces, a relaxed look, and a real feeling of relief. Seeing Buck there again was something that also made it feel complete. The last we saw of him, he was suffering in episode 7, so seeing him having returned and being amongst the brothers that he formed was nice to see. Whilst not all of the men went on to live the longest of lives, there were some stories that really stood out. For example, Webster going out into the ocean and getting lost at sea in the 60s was something which was harrowing to hear. But then also at the same time, the fact that George Luz had 1,600 people attending his funeral was so inspiring to hear, and it really showed the type of man that he was. The soundtrack that was underneath this voiceover in the scene was just absolutely beautiful, and it added so much emotion to the scene. We were at the end. We experienced a lot with these men. We lost a lot of the men with them, and in a strange way, it felt like we were part of the band of brothers with them. It felt hard saying goodbye to the characters because I felt like I genuinely knew them. It might sound silly to say, but as they ran off and as the camera got closer to Winters, I couldn't help but wipe a tear from my eye as I was just in awe of what I'd watched over the space of the 10-hour period. The interviews. Unlike every other episode in the show, the finale had the interviews right at the end of the episode, and it was definitely the best way to approach it. This show was ultimately about the real people that went through everything that was depicted in the show by the actors, so by allowing the real-life heroes to have the closing moments, it was the best way for it to be executed. Even with it finishing on Winters, Winters was pretty much the main person that we followed throughout Band of Brothers, so with it closing on him, it felt like the most appropriate way for it to close off. During the interviews, we saw Richard Winters, Carwood Lipton, Donald Malarkey, Bill Garnier, Babe Heffron, Shifty Powers, and John Martin. Whilst they were speaking, they were talking about their overall experience in the war and how they didn't necessarily view themselves as heroes on a personal level. For example, Heffron said how the men that were buried over in Europe and were flown back to be buried were the true heroes, and Garnier also said that he was only one small part in the big war that took place. There was a quote that Lipton said from Henry V, which was, "From this day to the ending of the world, we in it shall be remembered, we lucky few, we band of brothers. For he who today sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." This was a quote which again summed up the importance of every man that was there together and the bond that they had, which couldn't be formed outside the world of combat and in a situation where the chance of dying was extremely high. They shared a bond which could never be replicated and transcended everything else. Like Winters said in his interview, it's a very unusual bonding, but it was one which would be with them forever. One of the most emotional moments for me in the entirety of the series came with Winters' closing speech. He looked back on a letter that he wrote to his granny. They said, "I cherish the memories of a question my grandson asked me the other day when he said, 'Grandpa, were you a hero in the war?' Grandpa said, 'No, but I served in the company of heroes.'" As Winters was saying this, the emotions were building up inside of him, and you could see that he was struggling to get his words out as it was happening. That paired with the powerful nature of the words that he said left me feeling extremely emotional as the episode faded to black and the credits started rolling. The score in the background of it as well was something which was also so well suited and matched the emotion of what was being said. We saw the depiction of these band of brothers go through everything that they went through during the war, and it felt like we connected with these characters in a way that I've never done before in a TV show. But by having the real-life people being interviewed within the show, we saw the real heroes and the people that went through what we saw being depicted. This generation is often described as the greatest generation, and what they sacrificed for us is something that won't and should never be forgotten. I'm so glad that this show was made at a time where they were able to get many of the men that were part of the 101st Airborne Division to be able to be interviewed, because it really did add that extra layer of emotion to what we were watching unfold. A few words on the episode. For me, this episode is most definitely up there as being one of the best. There are so many good episodes in the show that they're genuinely all up there, but the tonal difference in this one, which really lent into the characters and their personalities as there was no fighting that was taking place, was just perfect. One thing that I thought this episode got across really well was that even though there was no immediate danger, not like there had been for the previous year, the men still had to be managed and death could still find a way of arriving if it wanted to. The interviews were some of the most powerful that there were in the show, and Winters closing it off in the way that he did was not only emotional, but it was so inspiring to watch. All of these men gave so much that they shouldn't be forgotten, and even though they wouldn't have been forgotten, this show is something that allows their memory and their legacy to live on in a completely different way. Even 20 years later, the show gets spoken about and is considered one of the greatest TV series of all time, and I don't question it in the slightest. I don't think there will be a better depiction of the Second World War in TV or film. This one did it first, and it did it in a way that had never been done before, so for that reason, it will always take that top spot in the category. I just want to say it's been a real pleasure delving into the world of Band of Brothers with you all. Thanks for tuning into every breakdown and the other videos that are released. I'm keen to cover some more classic TV series, so if there's any that you'd like to see, then let me know in the comments below. So, there you have it. A breakdown and a review of Band of Brothers episode 10. If you want to see every episode of Band of Brothers broken down, then click on the card in the top corner. There's an entire playlist there where you can go from the first all the way through to the end, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. What did you think of the finale to Band of Brothers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.